Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander down cobbled Roman streets where the air smells of smoke and fresh bread, even though the stars are still blinking in the sky. It feels strange at first, doesn't it? Bakeries roaring with fire long before the sun comes up, like someone scheduled breakfast for 3 a.m. and forgot to tell you. The truth is, in ancient Rome, if you wanted a warm loaf with your morning stroll to the baths, someone had to be up all night sweating near the ovens. And spoiler alert, that someone was not you. If you lived back then, you'd be snoring while other folks were hauling flour bags heavier than your New Year's resolutions. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a Roman bakery, mostly because the heat, the noise and the ash would smudge your toga faster than a spilled latte on white sneakers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love imagining this little community scattered across the globe, united by yawns and curiosity. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking in Rome, no cars, no street lamps, just the faint glow of oil lamps wobbling against brick walls, the kind of flicker that makes every alley feel like a mystery novel. But the mystery tonight is less about crime and more about carbs. The city above is silent, neighbors packed in tenement blocks dreaming of gladiators or gossip, while beneath them the bakers are already at war with time. The oven's massive mouths of brick and fire must be fed constantly. Imagine a pizza oven on steroids, fueled not by gas but by endless cartloads of wood. The bakers shovel in logs, fan the flames and curse under their breath when sparks singe their hair. Why at night? Because bread needs to be ready by sunrise. Romans didn't want to wait. A politician could lose votes if the public market opened with empty shelves. You can almost hear the hum of the city's stomach dictating the work schedule, like one giant alarm clock, set not by roosters, but by hunger. And so you, dragged into this ghostly shift, hear the rhythm, slap of dough against wood tables, hiss of water thrown onto hot stones, the muffled grunt of donkeys delivering sacks of Egyptian grain. Speaking of grain, Rome was obsessed. You might think coffee keeps modern cities alive, but back then it was bread. Without wheat, the empire itself would collapse. The phrase bread and circuses wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was policy. The people demanded food and entertainment, and woe betide any leader who forgot the bread, which meant bakers. The sweaty, ash-streaked night owls quietly held more power than anyone admitted. They were the invisible glue of society. Sure, nobody built statues for them, but miss one ration delivery, and suddenly you'd have riots at dawn. Now picture yourself leaning against a cool stone wall, watching the scene unfold. The bakers, mostly men, work half naked because the heat is brutal. Their muscles glisten in the glow, not like polished marble statues, but more like tired gym rats halfway through a workout they never signed up for. The dough itself looks alive, expanding, bubbling, sighing as if it knows its destiny. Each loaf is scored with marks, sometimes decorative, sometimes practical, so customers could tell their bread apart in the communal ovens. And here's a quirky fact. Some loaves were stamped with little symbols, almost like early branding. Imagine walking home with a round loaf embossed with a dolphin, or maybe the initials of the baker, proof you weren't scammed. Historians still argue whether these stamps were for pride, taxation, or just to avoid squabbles at the bakery door. The air smells nutty, yeasty, faintly sweet. It clings to your skin, the way popcorn scent sticks after a movie. You catch yourself thinking, this is the perfume of empire. Soldiers marched on it. Emperors feared shortages of it. Poets wrote casual metaphors about it. Bread was both ordinary and sacred, daily and divine. And right now you feel the odd tranquility of watching it all happen at an hour when you're usually asleep. Somewhere outside, a stray dog howls, chasing shadows. The city is never completely silent, but down here in the oven glow you hear only the chorus of baking. The bakers joke in Latin slang, insults tossed back and forth like dough balls. Someone sneezes dramatically, coating a friend in flour, and they laugh so hard one nearly drops a tray. You chuckle too, because it's nice to know that even 2,000 years ago, people still had slapstick humor at work. And yet, beneath the laughter, you sense the pressure. Grain shipments could be delayed by storms. Fires could gut bakeries in minutes. A single miscalculation, and entire neighborhoods would mutter angrily by sunrise. No one wants to face an angry Roman mob before their first bite of bread. It's a little like being a barista today, except your customers wear tunics and might throw amphora if their cappuccino isn't foamy enough. The hours stretch. The moon tilts west. The city remains tucked in its dreams, but you, sitting with the bakers, feeling the sweat on your brow and the ash in your hair, you realize that this midnight labor is the heartbeat of Rome. Invisible, uncelebrated, but essential. Without it, the empire's stomach would growl too loudly to be soothed by gladiators or rhetoric. And so the dough rises, the bread bakes, the fire roars. You lean back, your eyelids heavy, the rhythm oddly hypnotic. In this moment, you feel the soft tug of history and sleep mingling, as if the crackle of Roman ovens were meant to be your lullaby. You're still sitting near that oven glow, the warmth sticking to your skin. But the scene begins to widen, stretching outward from the cramped bakery walls to the empire's wide horizon. Because the flour in those sacks didn't just fall out of the Roman sky, it came from Egypt. And if you've ever complained about waiting 3 days for a package, imagine relying on ships crawling up the Mediterranean for weeks, their hulls packed with nothing but grain. Rome was basically addicted to Egyptian wheat, and the Nile was its supplier. Without those endless barges drifting north, your bakery night shift would be nothing more than a smoky cave with no dough to knead. Picture yourself standing at Alexandria's harbor centuries ago. The air smells of tar, brine, and sesame cakes roasting nearby. You hear the gulls argue above, wings flashing in the sunlight. Dock workers groan as they load sack after sack of grain into Roman ships, the kind that look like wooden bathtubs with sails stitched on top. Some captains pray to Isis or Poseidon, hoping storms stay polite. Others bribe dock officials, because even then paperwork was a nightmare. You smile at the thought. Bureaucracy, eternal across history. By the time these ships finally reach Ostia, Rome's port, the flour's journey has already been epic. Donkeys drag it inland, carts creaking like tired knees. You can almost feel the dust on your tongue, the same dust that will later puff into the bakery air when someone tears open a sack at midnight. All this effort, just to feed a city that chewed through thousands of tons of bread daily. Rome wasn't a place. It was a stomach. And the stomach demanded constant service. There's something amusing about it, isn't there? Emperors commanded legions. Poets composed odes. Philosophers debated the meaning of virtue, but none of them functioned without toast in the morning. Well, toast might be generous. Bread was the true breakfast of champions. Some loaves were hard enough that archaeologists later joked they could double as paperweights. You can imagine some Roman scholar saying, "Yes, this bread nourishes the soul," while secretly using it to prop up a wobbly table leg. The dependence on Egyptian grain was so total that Rome literally feared hunger riots. If you lived back then, you wouldn't just be worried about running out of milk. You'd be terrified that storms in the Mediterranean might leave the shelves empty. Emperors knew this. They played the long game, making sure those shipments kept coming. Julius Caesar, Augustus, even the less popular emperors, they all tried to secure the flow. Bread wasn't just food, it was political oxygen. Without it, the empire might choke. Now here's a curious tidbit. The ships carrying grain were often enormous compared to others of their age. Some descriptions mention vessels holding hundreds of tons of wheat, floating warehouses creaking over the waves. And while you might think bigger meant faster, nope. They crawled. If you took a nap while they left Alexandria, you might wake up months later in Ostia. Some scholars argue about how consistent those supply chains actually were. Were there reserves? Did the empire have secret stockpiles? Or were they always on the edge of shortage? The debates are endless, which is oddly comforting. You realize historians can argue just as long as friends deciding where to eat lunch. And while grain was the star, Egypt wasn't the only actor. Sicily, North Africa, and other regions chipped in. Picture caravans of camels lumbering through deserts, oxen trudging across rocky fields, farmers bent under sacks. Their sweat is hidden in every loaf you hold, the invisible ingredient baked into Rome's diet. You can almost taste the effort, nutty, earthy, faintly bitter, like bread laced with history. Back in the Roman bakery, someone makes a joke. This flour has seen more of the world than I have. They're not wrong. Some sacks traveled further than most citizens ever dreamed. You glance at the white powder clinging to the baker's forearms and think of Nile farmers, desert caravans, storm-tossed sailors, all of them working in the dark. Like the bakers, like you tonight, part of a hidden chain that feeds millions. You notice too how grain-shaped architecture. The city's granaries were massive, looming structures with thick walls designed to keep rats and damp at bay. Imagine walking by them. The smell of stored wheat so strong it tickles your nose. They looked almost like fortresses, which makes sense. Protecting grain was protecting survival. You wouldn't guard gold more fiercely than bread, because gold can't keep you alive when your belly growls. Somewhere a baker yawns, dust rising from his breath like ghostly smoke. He wipes his brow, mutters something about the Egyptians being late again, and returns to kneading. You smirk, because even then people blame delays on shipping. History repeats, only now it's emails instead of donkeys. And then you lean back listening again to the quiet chorus. Dough thumped, logs crackled, flour whispered against wood. And you realize the Empire's heartbeat wasn't in the Senate's marble halls, or the Colosseum's cheers. It was here, in sacks of grain dragged across seas, in flour dust curling through the dark, in bakers who worked so you could wake with bread already warm in your hand. You're still leaning against that flour-dusted wall, and the heat of the ovens hasn't let up. But your mind drifts from the sacks of grain to what all that wheat actually meant once it reached the mouths of Rome. Because here's the thing, you didn't always pay for bread. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, chances are you lined up for your daily ration, part of the famous annona. Think of it as a government-sponsored subscription box, except instead of fancy gadgets or mystery snacks, you got flour or bread, and instead of delivery to your door, you stood in a crowd of cranky neighbors before sunrise, clutching a token and hoping your loaf wasn't too stale. You can almost hear it now, the shuffle of sandals against stone, the mutter of voices, the occasional donkey braying like someone's alarm clock. The line snakes around public granaries, past fountains where kids toss pebbles to kill time. Above you, balconies creak as half-awake Romans peer down, grumbling about the noise, and you're there too, clutching your chit, waiting for the official with his wax tablet to call your name. When your turn finally comes, you receive your ration, a portion of flour or on better days, an actual loaf. You cradle it the way modern folks cradle takeout coffee, with gratitude, relief, and maybe a little suspicion about whether it's as fresh as promised. This system wasn't just about food. It was politics in edible form. Emperors knew that hungry citizens could turn the forum into a riot scene faster than you can say, "Who ate my bread?" The annona was a safety valve, keeping tempers cool and stomachs full. The phrase bread and circuses wasn't some clever metaphor. It was literally how leaders bought peace. Feed the people, entertain them with gladiators, and hope nobody notices the empire's bigger problems. But here's the quirky part. These distributions created their own drama. Imagine thousands of loaves stamped with marks to track which batch belonged where. Some were round, some divided into neat segments, almost like early pizza slices. Archaeologists even found charred loaves from Pompeii, preserved by the eruption, complete with bakery stamps. You picture someone grabbing their loaf, only to realize it's been overbaked, muttering the ancient equivalent of, ugh, burnt toast again. And not everyone qualified. Citizens got the free bread, but others, slaves, foreigners, the unlucky, had to buy theirs. Picture the subtle glances in line. Neighbors comparing rations, whispering complaints. You feel it. The same tension as when someone cuts ahead at a modern supermarket queue. People muttered, argued, occasionally threw hands. The bakers themselves were caught in the middle, trying to please officials and customers alike. You shift your weight, imagining what it would be like if your morning routine required standing in a bread line every single day. No strolling into a cafe. No scrolling on your phone while sipping espresso. Just waiting, hoping, praying the flour shipments arrived on time. Some historians argue over how efficient the system really was. Was there corruption? Almost certainly. Did loaves sometimes vanish into the hands of favored families? You bet. Scholars still debate how smoothly the annona ran, or whether it was one long crumb-strewn mess. Still, despite the grumbles, the bread was lifeline and symbol alike. The smell of it rising at dawn told the city it would survive another day. Politicians courted favor by expanding distributions, promising bigger rations, sometimes staging dramatic gestures. Look at me, your generous leader, ensuring none of you go hungry. It was theater as much as policy, each loaf a tiny ticket to loyalty. Back in the bakery, one of the workers grins, tossing you a roll still warm from the oven. You catch it clumsily, flour puffing against your chest. It's rougher than modern bread, darker, denser, the kind that requires strong teeth and maybe a splash of wine to wash it down. But it's good, nutty, solid, filling. You chew slowly, thinking how millions before you lived and died on this flavor. And here's a funny thought. In Rome, bread was practically a social leveler. Senators and street sweepers might eat different dinners, but come morning, everyone chewed on bread. The emperor himself could not escape the same daily crumb ritual. The difference was that his loaf arrived with a silver platter instead of a shove from a tired official. You chuckle, because in the end, bread was the great equalizer. Everyone needed it. Everyone complained about it. Everyone secretly wished it were just a little fresher. The oven crackles, a cart rumbles past outside, and you blink drowsily. You've seen how the grain fed the empire, how the rations kept crowds calm. The night stretches on, and still the bakers work, pressing, kneading, shaping the dough that tomorrow will be handed out in endless lines. You're still there in the dim light of the bakery, eyes half-lidded as the ovens pulse like fiery hearts. But now the focus shifts away from the bread itself to the people behind it, the bakers, who weren't just random flour-dusted guys sweating in the night. They belonged to something bigger, something official, the Collegium Pistorum, the Bakers' Guild of Rome. And once you joined, it wasn't like signing up for a gym membership you could cancel in January. No, this was closer to a lifelong contract, with your sweat, your family, and maybe even your soul. Imagine you've just been accepted into the guild. The senior bakers eye you with the kind of half-smile you'd expect from co-workers who know you're stuck for life. There's camaraderie, sure. Men sharing jokes over dough, trading tips on fire temperatures, but also a sense of obligation that clings heavier than flour dust. Because in Rome, baking wasn't just a job. It was a public service. Citizens expected their bread on time, and emperors demanded it, which meant the guild wasn't free to say, "Sorry, we're closed today." You feel the weight of it in your chest, the same way you'd feel if you discovered your new part-time job was actually the empire's entire food security plan. Leave the guild, forget it. Laws bound bakers to their profession. Families too. Sons of bakers became bakers as though flour ran in the bloodstream. You chuckle quietly, because in some ways it was like the worst career day advice ever. Once your parents were in, your destiny was sealed, and yet, being in the guild had perks. Members received exemptions from certain civic duties, no being drafted for military service or tedious public works. We can't march, a baker might argue. We've got ovens to tend. Rome agreed because an empty army camp was inconvenient, but an empty stomach could topple an emperor. So while soldiers got glory, bakers got protection. Different kinds of armor, you think. One made of bronze, the other made of crust. The guild also had rules, some of them strange enough to make you grin. Prices for bread were fixed by the state to prevent gouging. Loaves had to meet certain standards in weight and quality. If a baker cheated, say selling smaller loaves or slipping in poor flour, they risked punishment. Not just a scolding, but fines, public shame, or in extreme cases, exile from the guild. And that in Rome was basically career death. Imagine your boss not just firing you, but posting a sign saying, "This guy burns bread, don't trust him." Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced. Was every loaf weighed like a gold coin? Or did most slip by under the noses of sleepy inspectors? The truth is hazy, but the fact remains. The baker's work was monitored as carefully as a senator's speech. Bread, after all, was the people's daily referendum. And here's an odd fact. The guild was so essential that at times the emperor himself supervised it, appointing officials to oversee grain supply and bakery output. Picture Augustus strolling into a flour-dusted workshop, toga dragging dangerously close to dough. The bakers bow, flour sneezes clouding the air, and the emperor nods gravely at the loaves. "Yes," he says, "this will keep Rome happy another day." You smirk because nothing kills imperial dignity faster than a puff of flour. The guild also had its rituals. Members gathered for feasts, celebrated their patron deities, maybe even whispered gossip about rival bakeries. You can hear it. Laughter over cheap wine, the clatter of wooden cups, someone joking that they'd rather fight a lion in the Colosseum than keep an oven lit all night. And maybe beneath the humor, a shared weariness, the knowledge that tomorrow the work repeats. The bread must rise, always. You shift your shoulders, thinking how peculiar it is. Bakers weren't warriors or poets, yet their guild wielded real influence. They had the emperor's ear, the crowd's attention, the city's survival in their hands, invisible power masked by soot and flour. And once you joined, you could never really escape. Your eyelids dip lower as the fire hums, the guild's rules echoing in your mind like gentle chains, binding. Yes, but steady, predictable, almost soothing. You picture the long line of guild members across centuries, each one sweating by the fire, so that tomorrow Rome could wake, stretch, and eat. The ovens are roaring steady now, but your ears drift outward into the streets, where another part of the bread-making story unfolds. Because if bakers are the sleepless souls shaping dough in firelit rooms, someone else has to keep them supplied. And that means nighttime deliveries, the city's hidden heartbeat. You close your eyes and hear it, the creak of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the sharp clop of donkey hooves echoing through alleys, the occasional curse from a driver trying not to wake the whole insular apartment block. Picture it. Rome. Midnight or later, silent above but busy below. The streets twist like tangled spaghetti, narrow enough that two carts can't pass without someone backing up. Always a delight in the dark. Drivers balance lanterns on poles, their flicker casting giant wobbling shadows of donkeys against stone walls. From far away, the sight looks like a parade of strange beasts marching toward the bakeries. You smile because it feels almost magical, except these creatures are hauling sacks of grain and bundles of firewood, not treasure. The grain itself arrives in dusty cloth bags, each heavy enough to make your shoulders ache just looking at them. Drivers heave them down, grunting as flour clouds burst into the night air. Firewood follows, tied in rough bundles that scrape against the carts, leaving splinters in palms and streaks of resin on tunics. All of it must be ready before dawn, so the bakers won't lose a moment. You realize that Rome's mornings depended not just on ovens, but on these midnight laborers, unsung, invisible, like veins feeding the city's bread-making heart. And then there's the chaos. A donkey stumbles, tipping a sack, so that grain scatters across the cobbles. The driver groans, trying to scoop it up while muttering something that probably translates as, "This day can't get worse." Another cart loses a wheel, the load crashing sideways with the sort of noise that wakes an entire street. You imagine bleary-eyed tenants leaning over balconies, shaking fists, yelling the ancient Roman version of, "Keep it down, some of us are trying to sleep." But for all the grumbles, the system worked, or mostly worked. Deliveries happened night after night, keeping the cycle alive. Historians still debate just how organized it was. Were there schedules, fixed routes, or was it more of a chaotic free-for-all? Some evidence suggests that guild officials coordinated drop-offs, while others argue it was every cart for itself. The uncertainty lingers like the creak of wheels in the dark. You can almost smell it, the mingling scents of straw, donkey sweat, pine resin, and freshly split wood. Not exactly perfume, but it's the smell of Rome's survival. Without it, ovens would cool, dough would sour, and citizens would find themselves cranky at sunrise. A dangerous thing when those citizens had the habit of rioting over food. You think of it as the ancient equivalent of a coffee shortage. Imagine Rome without bread, like New York without bagels, Paris without croissants, or your kitchen without that one emergency pack of instant noodles. Unthinkable, and in the middle of it all you notice the drivers themselves, their cloaks pulled tight against the chill, eyes heavy with fatigue. They joke in whispers, trade gossip about which official is skimming off the top, complain about potholes the size of amphorae. One nudges another. "If I joined the Bakers Guild, I'd be sweating inside instead of freezing out here." The other shrugs. Both laugh, because either way neither of them will see their beds until sunrise. As you watch the procession fade, you realize how layered this nightly ballet really is. The bakers depend on the deliveries depend on the sailors depend on the farmers, and the farmers depend on the Nile floods, or the weather, or luck. Every loaf is the end of a long, fragile chain. Break one link, and the entire city feels it by morning. It's humbling, isn't it? You hold a simple crust of bread and taste not just flour and fire, but an entire empire's logistics. The oven behind you roars louder, fed by that fresh wood. A baker pats one of the donkey drivers on the shoulder, thanks him with a roll saved from the last batch. They grin, trade a quick joke, and the driver disappears back into the night, cart rattling over stones. The streets fall quiet again, at least until the next load arrives. Your head tilts back against the cool stone wall and your eyelids grow heavier. The night sounds fade into a rhythm. Wheel creak, hoofbeat, fire crackle, muffled laughter. And you realize this is what kept Rome alive. Not marble temples or fiery speeches, but the quiet, relentless clatter of deliveries in the dark. The firelight still flickers against your eyelids, and now your mind wanders from carts and guilds to the loaves themselves, the dizzying variety of bread that kept Rome's belly satisfied. Because here's the funny part. Not all Roman bread was created equal. What you chewed said a lot about who you were, like a secret social code written in crumbs. Imagine standing at a stall just after sunrise. Baskets overflow with round loaves, flat cakes, braided twists, and rolls dusted with flour. Some are golden and soft, others dark and dense like bricks disguised as food. You reach out, curious, and realize there's a whole menu here. A bread spectrum that ranges from humble to downright luxurious. For the poor or for soldiers marching across muddy roads, there was coarse bread packed with bran, sometimes bits of grit from millstones. It was rough on the teeth, filling in the belly, but no one called it artisanal. Soldiers nicknamed it panis militaris, bread for the march, sturdy and indestructible, just like their sandals. You grin because you can almost hear some legionary joking, "At least the bread won't fall apart before we do." Step up the ladder and you find softer loaves made from better flour. Bakers sometimes sifted wheat to make lighter dough, the kind that nobles preferred. The elite loved panis candidus, literally white bread. For them, paleness wasn't a flaw. It was a flex. White flour took more effort to refine, which meant only the wealthy could afford it. You bite into a slice and imagine smug senators congratulating themselves for eating the fluffiest crumbs in Rome. It's not unlike the way we once thought white bread in plastic bags was fancy. Before the pendulum swung back to whole grain, history really is just one long bread debate. And then there were special flavors. Some bakers laced dough with poppy seeds, honey, or herbs. One recipe called for cheese baked right into the loaf, making you wonder if a Roman had just invented the first stuffed crust pizza. Another mixed in olive oil and fennel, giving off a rich anise-scented aroma that would probably earn 5 stars on any food blog. You picture bakers grinning, handing out samples with a wink. Try this new batch, it's fennel forward but not pretentious. Not all recipes sound appealing though. Archaeologists found traces of bread flavored with mutton fat or even old wine. You wrinkle your nose but then shrug. After all, Romans liked garum, fermented fish sauce, in almost everything. If they could down that with a smile, a loaf soaked in wine probably wasn't too shocking. Some historians still argue whether those odder breads were treats or desperate improvisations. Either way, it's proof Romans were experimental, long before modern foodies. Festivals brought their own loaves, sweet buns glazed with honey, breads shaped like animals or wreaths, loaves big enough to feed a crowd. You imagine children chasing each other with sticky fingers, clutching pieces of festival bread as prizes. Somewhere in the crowd, a politician waves to the masses, proud to sponsor the celebration, and the bread that goes with it. Because in Rome, you didn't just throw a party. You fed one, and bread wasn't always eaten plain. People dipped slices in olive oil, smeared them with cheese, or dunked them in watered-down wine. Breakfast might be nothing more than bread and olives, but dinner could include loaves torn into soups and stews. You bite into another crust, crunchy at the edges, soft inside, and realize it's not so different from the way you enjoy bread today. The flavors change, the toppings shift, but the comfort remains. Here's the kicker. Bakers sometimes decorated loaves with marks or patterns before baking. Crisscross lines, deep stamps, or little symbols pressed in with tools. Some were practical, dividing the bread into slices for easy sharing. Others were artistic flourishes, early branding, you might say. Imagine grabbing a loaf with a dolphin stamped on top, proudly announcing, "This is from Marcus's bakery on the corner. Don't even try to fake it." Historians still debate whether these marks were for taxes, ownership, or just flair, but you can't help but grin. It's like Rome's version of putting your logo on a latte cup. You lean back, chewing slowly, the taste of Roman bread varieties filling your imagination. You realize that behind every loaf was a story. The soldier's ration, the senator's brag, the baker's experiment, the festival's feast. Bread wasn't just food. It was identity, tradition, and creativity rolled into dough. The oven hums behind you, warm and steady. Outside, carts rumble, the night rolling toward dawn. And in your hands you cradle a loaf that could be humble or noble, sweet or savory, heavy or light, but always essential. You let the crust crumble between your fingers, crumbs drifting like tiny echoes of the empire. The crust in your hand lingers on your tongue, but as you chew, you start to notice something else. This bread isn't only food. It's more than rations, more than morning routines. In Rome, bread had a sacred life of its own. It moved from ovens into temples, from markets into ceremonies, from ordinary mouths into the language of the gods. You close your eyes and feel the weight of that. How something as humble as dough and flour could cross the line from practical to divine. Take the Vestal Virgins, for example, the priestesses who kept Rome's eternal flame burning. They weren't just tending fire, they also prepared sacred cakes, molla salsa, made of flour and salt, which were sprinkled over sacrifices before animals were offered to the gods. Imagine standing in that hushed temple, smoke rising from incense, the air heavy with chanting, and someone carefully scattering flour across the altar. A quiet gesture, but one that connected the city to its divine patrons. Bread is a bridge between human hands and immortal ears. You smile at the thought. Modern folks bring wine to dinner parties, but in Rome the gods preferred their carbs salted. And then there were the festivals. Loaves shaped like animals offered during harvest celebrations, sweetbreads drizzled with honey for Saturnalia, or round loaves stacked as tokens of abundance during banquets. You picture a bustling crowd, music and laughter filling the forum, bakers proudly carrying trays of golden loaves as if they were crowns. Children reach for them with sticky fingers. Priests nod solemnly. Politicians beam as though handing out bread were a holy act, which in a way it was. The political side was just as important. Emperors and would-be leaders knew the symbolic power of a loaf. Bread wasn't just given, it was bestowed. Picture a politician standing on a platform, tossing loaves into the crowd like confetti. Cheers erupt, hands grab, people bite into still warm bread with joy. It wasn't just a snack, it was a promise. Stick with me and you'll never go hungry. Some scholars still debate whether this generosity was genuine or just clever bribery. You laugh softly because, of course, it was both. Politics has always known how to dress up practical bribes in sacred clothing. Bread even found its way into funerals. Families sometimes placed loaves or bread-shaped offerings in tombs, symbols of sustenance for the afterlife. You picture stepping into a Roman catacomb, cool air brushing your skin, and seeing baskets carved in stone relief, loaves forever etched into marble. The message was clear. Wherever you go, bread will follow. Eternal comfort, eternal routine. You think about that, and it's oddly soothing. No one facing the unknown without a crust in hand. Here's an amusing detail. Some loaves offered at rituals were burned intentionally, charred as gifts to the gods. You grin, imagining a priest carefully setting down a blackened loaf and announcing, "Perfect, just the way Jupiter likes it." Was it waste, or was it devotion? Historians still argue, but the symbolism was obvious. Bread, transformed by fire, was worthy of heaven. You shift against the stone wall, feeling the oven's heat behind you, the kind of warmth that could belong to either a bakery or a temple. And in that moment, the boundary blurs. The baker shoveling dough into fire is not so different from the priest scattering flour over flames. Both feed something larger than themselves, the city's stomach or the city's soul. The thought makes you smile drowsily. You can almost hear distant chanting mingling with the hiss of baking bread. The crowd in the forum, the quiet temple, the roaring oven, they're all tied together by loaves, simple loaves, each one carrying more meaning than its crust lets on. Your eyelids grow heavy. Bread isn't just food tonight. It's ritual, power, comfort, eternity. And as you breathe in the warm yeasty air, you wonder whether every crumb you taste is a prayer in disguise. The oven glow still hums behind you, but now the story drifts from temples and rituals into the steamy fog of another Roman obsession, the baths. Because in Rome, bread and baths were oddly linked, as if one ritual wasn't complete without the other. You rub your arms against the imagined damp air, and suddenly you're walking down mosaic corridors toward the echoing splash of water, your loaf of bread tucked under one arm like a towel. Picture the scene. Vast halls filled with marble pools, water heated by clever furnaces called hypocausts. Steam rises in soft clouds, making every surface shine, every conversation echo. Citizens of every class drift in, merchants, senators, freedmen, shedding their tunics and stepping into warm water. It's not just about hygiene. The baths are Rome's social network, the original group chat. Except instead of emojis, you get gossip and belly laughs, and somewhere in this routine, bread makes its entrance. Imagine stepping out of the caldarium, skin flushed from the hot bath, stomach growling after hours of soaking and chatting. What better companion than a fresh loaf? Vendors linger just outside the bathhouses, selling warm bread rolls dusted with salt, or flatbread stuffed with cheese or olives. You can almost taste the crunch of crust against your teeth, the steam rising as you tear it open, blending with the mist still clinging to your skin. It became a rhythm for some Romans. Bathe, then eat. Some even claimed the combination was healthier, that warm water opened the pores and made bread easier to digest. A little pseudoscience, probably. But you grin because we're not so different today. People swear by smoothies after yoga, protein bars after the gym, or ice cream after, well, anything. The pattern is ancient. Sweat, then snack. There are funny anecdotes, too. One writer joked about a senator who always insisted his bread be served after his bath, never before. It tastes better when the body is clean, he claimed. You smirk, imagining him sniffing a loaf like a wine connoisseur, nodding gravely. Ah yes, the pores are open. The bread sings. Meanwhile, his slave rolls his eyes, wondering why the boss can't just eat like a normal person. And the baths themselves smelled like a feast. Steam mixed with the scent of oil, perfumes, and sometimes, yes, bread. Vendors carried trays through the crowds, their voices echoing off marble. Hot rolls, fresh loaves. You imagine taking a bite while lounging on a bench, crumbs falling onto your damp toga, unconcerned. Because in Rome, comfort was communal, and nothing was more comforting than food shared in the afterglow of a bath. Historians still debate just how organized these vendors were. Did bathhouses contract bakers? Or did enterprising sellers just wander in, hoping to make a coin off hungry bathers? The truth is murky, like the tepidarium pools after too many bathers. But what's clear is that bread and baths created a little loop of daily indulgence, one of Rome's quiet luxuries. And here's a curious detail. Some medical writers of the time genuinely recommended bread after bathing, claiming it restored balance to the body. You can't help but chuckle. Modern health gurus write entire books about kale smoothies, but 2,000 years ago it was. Have a loaf. You'll feel better. Maybe they were onto something. As you lean back, you hear the overlapping sounds in your head, splashing water, laughter bouncing off stone, the crack of loaves being torn apart. You picture yourself reclining on a bench, skin still damp, chewing slowly on a crust while listening to the endless chatter. The world outside might be chaotic. Grain shortages, political upheavals, rival guild arguments. But here in the baths, bread and warmth offer a pocket of peace. Your eyelids droop. The baths dissolve into steam. The bread softens in your hand. You realize that for Romans, the small comforts were essential. Warmth, community, food. And isn't that the same today? You smile softly because some routines never age. Clean body, full stomach, content heart. The steam of the baths fades from your mind, and the bakery's warmth returns. But now your attention drifts to the dough itself, to the curious things Roman bakers were willing to mix in. Because plain wheat, as dependable as it was, sometimes needed a little flair. And if you thought artisanal bread trends were new, well, Romans had been spicing up loaves long before anyone used the phrase sourdough starter. Imagine a long wooden table, dusted white, where bakers lean over with bowls of add-ins. Some toss in fennel seeds, releasing a licorice sweet perfume. Others drizzle a little honey, turning the crust golden and sticky. You inhale and suddenly you're surrounded by aromas you didn't expect. Anise, rosemary, even nuts pounded into paste. A baker smirks at you, holds up a lump of dough streaked with melted cheese and winks. You'll want to try this one. Not every experiment sounds delicious, though. Some recipes called for mutton fat kneaded into flour, or stale wine added to moisten the mix. You frown, imagining biting into a loaf that tastes faintly of sheep and vinegar. Yet Romans didn't blink. Bread was flexible, a canvas for whatever the market offered. Goose fat, lard, even ground-up herbs you might only know from medicine, they all found their way into ovens. Some historians still debate whether these were delicacies or desperate improvisations. The line between luxury and necessity as thin as a knife scoring. Dough? One funny anecdote survives about bakers, slipping in secret ingredients to make loaves heavier, so they could meet the required weight without using more wheat. Picture biting into bread and suddenly crunching on ground chickpeas or worse, sand. Archaeologists have actually found loaves with traces of stone grit, probably from overworked mills, though maybe also from corner cutting. You wince, running your tongue against your teeth, and think, ancient dentists must have had plenty of business. But not all quirks were shady. Some loaves carried seasonings meant for festivals, sprigs of laurel tucked in for aroma, or dried fruits pressed into the crust for Saturnalia feasts. Children must have squealed with delight at raisins peeking from dough, the way kids today squeal for chocolate chips. Bread could surprise, could even feel like dessert. You grin at the thought of Roman foodies comparing notes in the forum. One says, "I only eat loaves with honey and poppy seeds now." Another replies, "Please, I only trust cheese-filled rolls." The rest are barbaric. You realize people haven't changed. Everyone thinks their favorite carb is the superior carb. And here's another oddity. Some bakers flavored dough with seawater instead of plain salt water, claiming it gave bread a richer taste. Was it culinary genius or just laziness by the seaside? Hard to say. Historians still argue whether those loaves were common fare or regional novelties. Either way, you picture yourself on a Roman coast, biting into a salty roll while waves crash in the distance. Not bad, you think. Not bad at all. The smells around you grow heady. Wine-warmed dough rising in one corner, herb-crusted rolls crackling in another, sweet buns dripping honey nearby. Your senses blur, the variety overwhelming, like wandering through a festival of flavors. It makes you laugh quietly, because if someone handed you a loaf made with goose fat, fennel, and leftover wine, you'd probably wrinkle your nose. But for Romans, it was normal. And maybe, just maybe, you'd grow to crave it too. You lean back, eyelids heavy, the fragrances wrapping around you like a blanket. Bread wasn't only sustenance, it was experiment, indulgence, even mischief. Every bite carried both comfort and surprise. And as your head dips lower, you think, the empire may have run on wheat, but curiosity was baked in too. The scent of honey and fennel fades, and the crackle of ovens comes back into focus. But now your mind tilts toward the darker, well, maybe more embarrassing, side of baking in Rome. Because when bread was life itself, cheating at bread wasn't just annoying. It was a civic offense, and Rome, as always, had a flair for punishing cheaters in ways both practical and ridiculous. You picture a baker, sweaty and tired, slipping a little extra bran into the flour to save money, or shaving a few ounces off a loaf hoping no one notices. Maybe he thinks he's clever. Maybe he thinks he's too small for the system to care. But then comes the customer, weighing their ration on a scale, frowning. Whispers spread. Before long, the baker is hauled before officials, standing sheepishly while neighbors point and mutter. The punishments varied. Fines were common, coins clinking from the baker's pouch into the state's coffers. But sometimes the penalties went public. Imagine being paraded through the streets with your bad loaves strung around your neck, like some ridiculous necklace. People laugh, children point, someone shouts, "Maybe next time bake something worth chewing." You wince sympathetically, though you can't help but grin at the slapstick justice of it all. In some cases, entire bakeries could be shut down. Ovens cooled, workers dismissed, customers left fuming. For the city, this was serious business. Bread shortages could spiral into riots, so any hint of fraud was stamped out. Historians still debate how harsh these punishments really were, whether most bakers escaped with a warning, or whether Rome truly loved to make examples out of them. The evidence is patchy, but the fear was real enough to keep most loaves honest. Here's a curious twist. Sometimes, rather than punishing with pain, officials punished with shame. A baker caught shortchanging customers might be forced to sit in the marketplace, loaf in hand, while passers-by mocked him. You imagine sitting there, red-faced, while every neighbor you know walks past muttering about your crust. Honestly, you think, that might sting worse than a fine. Reputation was currency, and once your bread was branded untrustworthy, customers drifted to someone else, and yet, mistakes happened. Ovens burned too hot, dough didn't rise, flour shipments arrived musty. Was every bad loaf the result of trickery? Probably not, but customers didn't care. If your bread cracked teeth or crumbled to dust, you'd hear about it. You chuckle softly because it's the same today. Burn one batch of cookies for friends, and they'll remind you of it for years, There are whispers, too, of bakers being tied to their profession almost like prisoners. Leave the guild? Impossible. Fail to meet quotas? Punishable. In a way, the punishments weren't only about bad bread. They were about keeping the system airtight. The city couldn't risk gaps in the chain, so bakers bore the weight of responsibility. You rub your eyes imagining the stress. Every loaf a test, every crust a potential scandal. Still, not every punishment was cruel. Sometimes the system leaned absurd. One satirical story describes a baker forced to eat his own bad loaves in front of the crowd. You grin at the thought, choking down hard crusts while people cheer ironically. Did it happen often? Maybe not. But the fact Romans told the story means they loved the idea. Nothing like poetic justice, even when it's stale. The ovens roar on. A baker nearby mutters a prayer under his breath, hoping today's batch will pass muster. He wipes sweat from his brow, eyes darting nervously toward the door as though inspectors might stroll in at any moment. You sense the tension under the laughter, the pressure behind the rhythm of kneading. This wasn't just baking. It was a civic duty, a gamble, a performance. One bad loaf and you might be the joke of the forum by sunrise. Your eyelids sag. The punishment scenes blur in your mind. Mock parades, shameful feasts of failed bread, stern officials wagging fingers. You chuckle faintly, because even in its seriousness it feels more like comedy than cruelty. Rome may have been harsh, but it also loved spectacle. And sometimes, even bread scandals had to be entertaining. The laughter of the crowd fades, and the smoky heat of the ovens settles back into a steady hum. But your thoughts wander now, away from guild halls and punishments into the quieter corners of Roman life, homes, kitchens, families, because while the Bakers' Guild was dominated by men sweating through the night, women still had their own long relationship with bread. Only theirs was hidden in domestic spaces, bound to the rhythms of the household rather than the city. Picture a Roman kitchen, not a gleaming modern one, but a cramped room, stone walls darkened with soot, the air heavy with the smell of ash. A small clay oven squats in one corner, fed by kindling and scraps of wood. You hear the scrape of a knife, the hiss of water poured over flour. A woman kneels there, sleeves rolled back, kneading dough while children chase each other through the doorway. The loaf she shapes won't be stamped with official seals or inspected by guild overseers. It's for her family, eaten at the same rough table where she'll mend tunics and scold sons. The work is just as demanding, though. Kneading takes muscle, patience, rhythm. Her palms press down, fold, press again, until the dough sighs like a tired chest. You try it in your own imagination, and already your wrists ache. Bread at home wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, daily, grounding, as ordinary as breathing. And here's the odd part. Though women were the backbone of domestic baking, they rarely appeared in the professional guilds. The Collegium Pistorum was overwhelmingly male. Why? Historians still debate. Some argue it was simply the scale of labor. Industrial ovens, heavy carts, night work in dangerous streets. All things that pushed women out. Others suggest it was about prestige, that Rome's official bakers were too entangled with politics and supply chains to open the doors. Whatever the reason, the bakery was men's territory, while the home remained women's domain, yet that doesn't mean women were absent from Rome's bread culture. Far from it. Roman authors occasionally mention wives selling small loaves in markets, or widows running tiny ovens to feed their neighborhoods. They may not have worn guild seals, but they carried their craft quietly, sustaining families and corners of communities. You imagine a grandmother at a market stall, face wrinkled, eyes bright, handing you a warm roll with a joke. Eat this and you'll grow strong enough to fight gladiators, or at least chase your goats. There's also the symbolic role. In some festivals, women prepared ritual breads at home, shaping them with care, infusing them with prayers as much as yeast. Loaves became tokens of love, offerings of devotion, signs of fertility or prosperity. A bride might bake bread for her new household, sealing the transition from daughter to wife. You can almost feel the tenderness of that act, kneading not just dough but a future. Still, the line between home and guild was stark. You smile at the irony. Men were lauded as civic saviors for keeping the city fed, but women were quietly expected to do the same within four walls, without statues or seals. Yet both kinds of bread sustained Rome. The crust in the marketplace and the crust at the family table were equally crucial. And then there are whispers of resistance. One story tells of women stepping in during shortages, baking when guildmen failed to meet quotas? Did they save the day only to be forgotten in the records? Probably. History is full of unsung bakers in aprons rather than togas. You grin wryly. Rome loved a good hero story, but often skipped the ones without marble temples or political speeches. The oven beside you hisses. A woman's hands seem to flicker in the firelight. Ghostly echoes of countless mothers and daughters who baked in silence. You feel their presence humble yet steady, a chorus beneath the louder guild songs. And you realize that Rome's bread wasn't just stamped by officials or tossed in crowds. It was carried in calloused hands, shared in dim kitchens, passed across wooden tables with soft laughter. Your eyelids grow heavy again, lulled by the thought of kitchens humming quietly, flour dust floating like stars in lamplight. Bread may have been power, politics, and punishment, but it was also care, comfort, and love. And those loaves, though unnamed, kept the empire alive just the same. The warmth of the oven lingers on your skin, but now the rhythm shifts. The steady hum of dough rising and carts rumbling is broken by a shiver of unease, because Rome's bread story wasn't always smooth. Sometimes the chain cracked, grain shipments stalled, fields withered, ships sank, or sickness swept through. And when that happened, bread in Rome became more than food, it became a crisis. You picture a summer with no rain in Egypt. The Nile shrinks, the flood that normally feeds the fields fails to come. Farmers stand in cracked soil, staring at withered stalks. The harvest is thin, the sacks lighter. The ships sent north carry half their usual load, and everyone knows the math. Fewer loaves in Rome. Already you can hear whispers in the forum, the mutters spreading like smoke. The grain is late. The rations will shrink. People grow restless before the ovens even cool, and when the shortage hits, the city feels it like a stomach cramp. Lines for bread stretch longer, voices sharper. Rations shrink, loaves cut smaller, flour mixed with more bran to stretch it further. Do you imagine biting into a crust so dense it feels like chewing bark? Mothers grumble, children cry, officials sweat as the crowd's mood sours. The baker, poor soul, is suddenly the focus of everyone's anger, as though he conjures grain himself. Wars made it worse. Picture Roman ships blockaded by enemies, or pirates stalking the Mediterranean, hijacking grain convoys. You can almost hear the splash of waves against stolen vessels, the laughter of raiders tossing sacks overboard. Back in Rome, people don't see pirates. They see empty baskets. The connection is invisible, but the anger is immediate. Crowds storm bakeries, accusing them of hoarding. "Where's our bread?" they shout. Bakers who barely sleep already become scapegoats overnight. And then the plagues. Disease spreads, farmers die, labor falters. Whole households vanish, leaving fields unharvested. Ships wait with no crews, carts with no drivers. In Rome, ovens burn lower, and the streets echo with hollow hunger. The city, once fat with grain, suddenly feels thin, fragile, almost breakable. You shiver, because you know hunger is more dangerous than any army. Emperors could survive invasions, but not riots over empty tables. Some emperors scrambled for solutions. Augustus once bought grain at his own expense, doling it out to calm the crowd. Claudius, faced with a shipping disaster, supposedly stood in the marketplace to reassure people, risking his life among angry citizens. Imagine him there, toga damp with sweat, saying, "The grain will come, trust me," while everyone eyes him like a loaf about to be sliced. Historians argue about the details. How generous were these gestures, how effective? But the fact remains, emperors knew bread was their throne's foundation. Lose the bread, lose the people. For bakers, crisis meant improvisation. They mixed barley or oats when wheat ran low, added beans or chestnut flour to stretch dough. Loaves grew darker, denser, less appetizing. Some customers accepted it with a grimace, others accused bakers of fraud. You grin faintly because it's the same today. Change a recipe, and someone complains it doesn't taste like it used to. Except back then, complaints weren't Yelp reviews, they were riots. And yet in those moments, bakers sometimes became reluctant heroes. A guild that once felt chained now seemed vital, even noble. Men who once cursed their ovens now felt the city's survival depended on their hands. You picture them, sleeves rolled up, flour on their brows, working until dawn with whatever grain scraps they could find. The loaves weren't pretty, but they were something, enough to keep bellies quiet for another day. You lean back against the stone wall, eyelids heavy, imagining the tension. The fire still glows, But the air feels different now, anxious, taut, humming with desperation. You realize bread wasn't just comfort. It was Rome's pulse. When it faltered, the whole body of the city shook. And yet, even in crisis, life went on. Loaves cooled on racks. Children gnawed at crusts. People still gathered around crumbs to gossip and joke. Bread, even imperfect, still bound them. And maybe that's the most soothing thought, that even in scarcity and fear, in nights when ovens nearly went cold, the city found a way to keep rising with the dough. The tension of shortages and riots fades, and now your thoughts float toward lighter days, festivals when bread wasn't a crisis but a celebration. The oven heat still glows, but in your imagination it expands outward into the forum, where stalls gleam with honey, drums pound, and laughter bounces off marble walls. Rome loved a spectacle, and bread was part of the show. Picture Saturnalia, the great winter festival. The city turns upside down. Slaves dine like masters. Gifts are exchanged, candles flicker in windows. And everywhere, bread sweetened with honey and spices fills the air with perfume. You can almost taste it. Sticky rolls pressed with nuts, loaves shaped into wreaths, flat cakes glistening with sesame. Children run wild, clutching buns in their fists, smearing honey across their cheeks. You smile softly. Some things never change. Or imagine the Floralia in spring, a riot of flowers and theatre. Vendors wave bright blossoms and trays of bread shaped like animals. Hares, birds, even tiny pigs. A baker hands you a dove-shaped roll, its wings scored into the dough, and laughs. Eat quickly before it flies away. You bite into it and grin, because it tastes like celebration itself. Bread also had a political role at these festivals. Politicians sometimes staged grand giveaways, tossing loaves into the crowd like prizes at a carnival. Imagine standing in a roaring mob, hands raised, cheering as rolls arc overhead, caught by lucky fingers. The crowd surges with joy, bellies full, loyalty renewed. Some emperors used these moments to prove generosity. Others used them to distract from scandals. Historians still argue about motives. Were they benevolent or manipulative? You chuckle because the answer is probably both. And then there were the games. At the Colosseum, amid roars of beasts and cheers of gladiators, food was often handed out. Bread with olives, rolls with cheese, flatbread sprinkled with herbs. Enough to keep the crowd satisfied through hours of spectacle. You lean back and hear it. The clash of steel, the growl of lions, the softer crunch of thousands of jaws chewing in unison. Bread wasn't just sustenance. It was part of the entertainment package. Proof that Rome could feed and thrill you all in one afternoon. There's even record of loaves being baked gigantic for display. Imagine a bread so large it took several men to carry, paraded through streets like a trophy. The crowd gasps, points, laughs, and cheers. It's impractical, ridiculous, and utterly Roman. You think about modern state fairs with giant pies and watermelons, and you realize people have always loved food as theater. And festivals gave bakers freedom to experiment. Loaves dyed with saffron for golden color. Breads braided into elaborate shapes, cakes decorated with pine nuts or dried figs. The ordinary crust became art, fleeting but dazzling. You picture rows of festival breads like jewels in baskets, each one eaten before the day ends, leaving only sticky fingers and crumbs on stone streets. The mood softens in your mind. After crisis, after shortages, after the tension of riots, here is release. Bread not as necessity, but as joy. Families laugh. Lovers share bites. Children lick honey from their hands. The city forgets its worries for a day, united not by hunger but by delight. You lean against the wall, eyelids heavy, hearing distant echoes of festival drums blending with the crackle of the oven. Bread has carried Rome through famine and feast, anger and laughter. Tonight, in your drifting thoughts, it tastes sweeter, lighter, almost like memory itself. The laughter of festival crowds fades like smoke, and the bakery walls return warm and steady. But this time you notice the tools lying scattered across the flour-dusted tables. Wooden paddles, iron hooks, stone mills turning slowly. And you realize behind every loaf was not just muscle and sweat, but invention. Rome's bakers were tinkerers, experimenters, the kind of people who couldn't help but ask, can this oven work a little smarter? Can this dough rise a little faster? Take the rotary quern, for instance. Those heavy circular stones stacked one atop the other, turned by hand or donkey. Simple yet clever, grinding grain finer than pounding with a stick ever could. You run your fingers across the ridges and feel history in the grooves. the lines worn deeper by centuries of use. And you picture bakers sighing in relief when these querns replaced hours of pounding. Though their backs still ached, their flour still dusted every fold of their tunic. Then there were the ovens. Some were designed with rotating bases, so loaves could be baked evenly without constant turning. Imagine a baker grinning proudly, giving the base a push, watching the bread circle slowly like planets orbiting a sun of fire. Did it always work perfectly? Probably not. You chuckle, imagining dough slipping to one side or loaves colliding like bumper cars. Still, the creativity was there. Early whispers of automation. Romans also used clever proofing tricks. They sometimes wrapped dough in warm cloths or set bowls near the residual heat of baths, using steam to coax yeast alive. You lean in, inhaling that tangy scent, realizing it's not so different from modern bakers, hovering over sourdough starters, coaxing bubbles from jars. 2,000 years, same anxious question. Is it rising yet? Some innovations were born of necessity. When wood ran scarce, bakers experimented with alternative fuels. Vine cuttings, dried reeds, even animal dung. You wince imagining the smoke, the acrid smell. Yet they endured, because empty ovens were unthinkable. Bread had to be made, and if it meant using whatever burned, then so be it. Not all inventions survived. Archaeologists hint at lost tools, dough-dividing knives, scoring stamps, even early bread molds that gave loaves uniform shapes. Some must have worked brilliantly. Others were abandoned, forgotten in the churn of history. You smile because it's the same with gadgets today. One generation swears by its bread machine. The next leaves it gathering dust in a cupboard. And here's a curious fact. Some bakers developed techniques for long storage. Hard breads that could last weeks without spoiling. Perfect for soldiers or travelers. Were they tasty? Not exactly. You can almost hear a legionary groaning, gnawing on a loaf so hard it could double as a shield. Yet it was practical, and practicality often won. Historians still debate just how widespread these travel breads were, but they were lifelines when supplies ran thin. The guild may have enforced tradition, but innovation still crept in. Quiet, practical, often invisible. No one wrote poems about a new kneading method, but those little changes made life bearable. And in a way, these forgotten sparks of ingenuity are as Roman as aqueducts or amphitheaters. Just smaller, humbler, baked into crust instead of carved in stone. You let your eyes drift shut, imagining the clatter of querns, the scrape of paddles, the creak of an oven turning slowly. All those hands, all those minds, nudging bread a little closer to perfection, even if history forgot their names. And you think innovation doesn't always need glory. Sometimes it only needs to rise. The tools lie quiet now. Ovens sigh their last bursts of heat. And outside, the first pale shimmer of dawn begins to brush the rooftops of Rome. You lean your head back against the cool stone and realize the baker's night is ending. Their arms ache, their brows drip with sweat, but racks of golden loaves are stacked and ready. The city above is stirring. Doors creak open, sandals scrape stone, and the rhythm of day replaces the hush of night. You watch the bakers stretch, rubbing tired shoulders, wiping flour from their beards. They glance at each other with small smiles. Not triumph exactly, but relief. Another night survived, another dawn supplied. The bread is lined up, the city will eat, the empire will hold. Nobody thanks them, not really. Rome will march on, too busy with politics, gossip, and gladiators. But in this quiet twilight moment, you know the truth. Without these men and their ovens, Rome would crumble faster than a stale crust. The streets fill slowly, voices rising. Women with baskets greet the bakers. Children tug at tunics. Officials take their ration notes. The air smells of warm wheat, mingling with morning dew and smoke from the last logs. You bite into a piece of bread still warm from the oven. The crust crackles, the inside steams, and you chew slowly, savoring it not just as food, but as history itself. Centuries of labor baked into every crumb, and then your thoughts soften, loosening like flour drifting through air. You think back over the night, the grain ships crawling from Egypt, the guild rules binding bakers, the donkeys clattering through dark streets. You remember the strange breads flavored with wine, the punishments for cheats, the women kneading quietly at home. You remember the crises and the riots, the festivals and their honey-slick rolls. And you remember the inventions, rotating ovens, clever tools, small sparks of brilliance hidden in soot. The city is awake now, but you are sinking deeper into stillness. You imagine Rome stretching, yawning, tearing open loaves as sunlight spills across marble. And you sitting in the corner of a bakery, eyes half closed, drifting. The fire crackles softer like a lullaby. The scent of bread is everywhere, rich and sweet, like the earth itself is whispering comfort. Your breath slows. Words lengthen. Images blur. The bakers fade into shadows. Their voices dim to murmurs. The city's noise becomes distant, muffled, like waves pulling back from shore. You are left only with warmth, with the steady hum of ovens cooling, with the gentle certainty that bread will rise again tomorrow, and in that certainty, you rest. No more riots, no more festivals, no more carts clattering through the dark. Just quiet, just crust, just the rhythm of history dissolving into the rhythm of sleep.